are changing a little bit, and obviously we're not doing this face-to-face. So I encourage you to use the chat feature. At the end, we'll take time for questions. Okay, it's a little bit more personal because it's straight on your computer screen. So I want you to feel free to reach out and ask any questions that may come up. The other nice thing is Dr. Behel is going to be talking about stress after this, and there's nothing more stressful than in these times. It's been a very strange days, 2020, and so what we're talking about is all of the good things, all of the ways that we're working to make things better. And so we'll be talking about prostate cancer, which affects so many people. So before I dive in, there's a picture here of one of the grandfathers and the founders of our field of urinary tract cancer. His name was Willett Whitmore. He passed away back in the 80s, but he started the first specialty fellowship training at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And I point out some of his sayings that he's famous for, because a lot of the things that have been troubling us in prostate cancer screening and management have been known for years and years and years. They're not a surprise. It didn't require science. Anybody that was paying attention knew that it's a problem. And so one thing he said was, and this was way back when, way before, you know, the 2020s, it was back in the 70s and 80s he said this. He said the current state of prostate cancer may not be good medicine, but it sure is good business. There are more people making a living from prostate cancer than there are dying from it. And he didn't say that tongue-in-cheek, but he was alluding to the fact that we may overtreat it, maybe overtreating it. Another thing he said was, is cure possible? Is cure necessary? Could it be that is cure possible only when it is not necessary? Meaning, are we curing a bunch of cancer that's not hurting a patient, and are the ones that aren't curable the ones that are slipping out of our fingers? So what he was saying is that there's an issue of overtreatment and undertreatment, and I'd like to say that just because it turns out that many of the problems that we know, they've been problems for years and years and years. So some background on prostate cancer. The reason we talk about it is that it affects so many men. Here it is. Here's a list of all the different cancers, the top 10 cancers. And in terms of new cases of cancers diagnosed, prostate cancer is the number one. Almost 200,000 men in the United States are diagnosed with prostate cancer every year. It's about 20% of new cancer diagnoses, okay? And having said that, it's number two in terms of how many men die of it. It's over 30,000, and that number has changed over the years, okay? So there is a big difference between the number of people that die. If you look at lung cancer, here you have 115,000 people with it, and 72,000 people a year die of it. So the vast majority of people with that kind of cancer die of their cancer. But with prostate cancer, you can see there's almost 200,000 men identified with it, but only a small fraction are dying every year. And it's usually not the same people. It's not that first year, right? But here you can see more and more people are being identified with cancer, but they're not dying of it, okay? So our goal is to figure out who these people are and really catch them and save them. So this emphasizes that point. This is from the American Cancer Society. And what it says here is most men with prostate cancer die with it, not of it. You can see that very clearly here. You'd have to get 41 patients together for one of them to die of it, and that's on average. Now, it is true that certain populations of men are hit a little bit harder from this for reasons that we're studying, and some reasons we know, some reasons we don't. Amongst African Americans, it's not so much 1 in 41, it's more like 1 in 15. But still, the vast majority of men who have cancer live with it and die of other reasons, okay? And our real goal will be focusing on the ones with the worst cancers, okay? So this is a graph that shows all of these different kinds of cancer. And I point out this here, if you guys can see my arrow, there's a brown line here where it goes up and then it starts coming down. And this is deaths per 100,000 males of different cancers. And you can see back in the 80s and 90s, lung cancer, as we started treating it and as people stopped smoking, over the years, it really came down. And similarly, you can see in prostate cancer back in the 90s that cancer deaths started really coming down. And to the point where in the 2010s, and early in 2010, people were feeling really good about it. So much so that the death from prostate cancer was back to the level of the 30s. And I put this graph below it. Back in the 30s, the average man lived to less than 60 years old. And here's a life expectancy graph. We know that prostate cancer is a disease of aging. And so if you died of a car accident or an industrial accident at work, or we don't die on the highways as much because of seatbelts and airbags, and we have antibiotics. And so over the years, you can see we don't live to just barely 60 in the United States. Now a man can expect to live well into his 70s and almost 80, right? And so as a result, over the years, you'd expect to see prostate cancer go up and up and up because we have an aging population. But all of a sudden, back in the 90s, when we discovered new ways of screening for prostate cancer, the death rate from prostate cancer started dropping considerably, almost about 40%. All right. And as a result, here's a graph here. You can see for all Americans, Caucasian Americans, and African Americans separated, you can see that very few men actually die of their cancer unless we find it at a very late stage. This is, if it's still in the prostate, this is in the area around the prostate. And this is, yes, most men will die of their cancer within 5 years if we don't catch it early in time. But overall, very few people die. Here it's 98% of men live at least 5 years if they are caught, especially if they're caught quickly. Okay. So you might understand why I put a slide up here. Back in the early 2000s and 2010, we were feeling good about this. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with the slide, this is a picture of when we supposedly won the war in the Middle East. They put all the guys up on an aircraft carrier, and they put up a banner that said "Mission Accomplished." But I think this was back in the early 2000s, and it said "Mission Accomplished," right? And as you know, as we all know, we're still in the Middle East, and we're still fighting. So that's why I put, was our mission accomplished? The surgeons were feeling, and the doctors and the medical doctors and all the doctors were feeling really good about prostate cancer, because here you can see very few people were dying with it from within 5 years, as opposed to 30 years prior. It was almost a third of patients died of it within 5 years. Okay. And so we made huge headway. And yet, right around then, in the year 2012, we get a grade card from the government, and it says that we get a D. And there's a lot of people that were very upset about that, because they were looking at sort of these deaths. There's a lot of feedback that said, no, actually, you're over-treating prostate cancer. And I think that most experts did agree. And what they noted is that there was many people that were being treated alongside the people that were benefiting that weren't benefiting as much. So we got very busy, right? And on the grade card where the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force, and there's a lot of data. This was based on papers and research that showed maybe all of the things weren't benefiting. And one of the things that was, there's no current way to determine which cancers are likely to threaten a man's health and which are not. Okay, I don't know if that's true, and we've gotten better since then. It says, almost all men with prostate cancer opt to receive treatment. That was true then, and that is not true now, and I'm going to go through that. They said there were frequent complications of biopsy. That was true then, and we're working on that. And it says there's serious harms of treatment. That was true then, and it's still true now. Okay, they said that for every 1,000 men that are screened, people will have lots of urinary and sexual side effects. They said you can get heart attacks and blood clots and other health problems from treatment, and you'll have complications. And what they said is at that time they couldn't justify it. Many people were getting treated that weren't benefiting from it. And I emphasize that because we have ways at the time of diagnosis to predict how bad the cancer is. We can look at it under the microscope. We can look at blood tests. For the same ways that we find the cancer, we can predict how bad the cancer is. And one thing I want to point out to you is this is from the middle of the 2000s, based on how we practiced in the 90s and early 2010. And basically what you can see here is that regardless of whether you had low risk, intermediate risk, or high risk, we treated the cancer very similarly. The way these graphs are pointed out is you have the young patients down low, the medium-sized age patients, the 65 to 74-year-olds in the middle, and the older patients on the right. And they pointed out whether they had no surgery. So this is the blue bar, radiation or surgery, which is the radiation is green and the orange is surgery. And what we found was, regardless of whether it's low risk, intermediate risk, or high risk, we treated everyone the same, which is a problem because many of these low risk patients probably didn't need surgery or radiation. And many of these high risk patients, just because they're older doesn't mean they don't need treatment. Okay, we can just have to find them the right treatment. And so this isn't a matter of just finding who can tolerate treatment and giving them treatment. It's a matter of being more precise and personalizing care and not ignoring the signs and ways to predict. So this concept of taking low-risk patients and watching them and not putting them through the meat grinder, not throwing and treating everyone that you can see and getting your hands on. This concept of finding people that are at lower risk and are more likely to die of other reasons and following them instead of going straight to treatment is called active surveillance. And a good friend of mine, he's a urologist, he sent surveys to doctors. He sent surveys to 700 doctors, both surgeons, the urologists or surgeons, and radiation oncologists, and he asked them why they felt it was so difficult to start active surveillance. And a good number of them said that they felt that it was very effective. It was safe and effective. Okay? So 70% of them, more surgeons felt it was effective than radiation oncologists. Okay? They felt that they were comfortable recommending it. Right? So they felt it was safe. But they said that the patients weren't interested in it. More radiation oncologists said the patients weren't interested in it than surgeons. And they actually blamed the patient. That's not been my personal experience. My personal experience is if you comfort the patient and you educate the patient, you tell them, you explain to them that if we monitor it, it's safe, then we don't have to be as aggressive. And many patients that I see are very open to that. So we finally, in the United States, we were really behind in this because we're kind of doers, right? We see something, we go at it, we attack it, right? But some of the leading surgeons in Canada, this is the group in Toronto, they started early, and at the time, American surgeons called them dangerous, and they said that He was killing his patients. But they stuck with it, and they proved over a 10-year period, this is from 15 years from 1995 on, they picked the lowest aggressive people. They had 1,000 patients, and in 2015, he published an update on the data. And what he found is most of them, and almost nobody died of their cancer. Now, 15 men died of their cancer. It's not nobody, right? And this was with old tools. I'm going to show you newer tools. Now, even if you treat patients, a few of them do die of their treatment, of their cancer. And so what they concluded was that it's very safe. Even with their older tools, now we even have newer tools, right? And they said, no, the way I think of it is we absolutely need to use this as an example to say we can safely follow men for long periods of time, help them avoid treatment, so that now some of them ended up needing treatment later, it got worse, right? But no one was, it's not like this was dangerous or awful. What it did, it allowed some men to stay away from the side effects of treatment for 10, 10 or 15 years. So what I want to do is find those 15 guys, the ones that slip through the cracks, so that it's very safe. And you'll see that with newer tools, we're able to do that. So since then, it's more than just the Canadians. In Sweden, in other groups in Canada, here's a Danish trial. And then in California, at UCSF, they were very advanced in this way of doing it. And what they found is, now it's still early going, they were even able to advance it. So more and more people are doing this method, where they're doing it for low risk and even intermediate risk, well-selected intermediate risk. And if you can see here, almost everyone, 5-10 years later, the chance of dying of your cancer, here's 15 years. Nobody died in Vancouver, okay? For intermediate risk, they're picking their patients very well. And very few people are dying despite, and this is even for the people that aren't the lowest risk. These are even well-selected patients with intermediate risk cancer. And so they are able to save sometimes up to half of them from treatment, right? Meaning some guys will never need treatment ever, despite the fact they were identified with cancer. So that's great. Now you can see in the United States, we've been very slow to adopt this. Less than 20% of our patients are doing this. It sort of drifted up to about 30. Here's a newer slide that was a snapshot of the group at Michigan, all of the practices in Michigan, and it's about 50-50. And you can see here, some practices very much embrace it. 80% of their patients that are low risk get initial observation, and others are very aggressive, meaning everybody's getting treated. Only 20% of their patients aren't doing it. Okay. And so this number is growing, and as opposed to the patients, blaming the patients about it, but I think that the guidelines committees and doctors are coming around that this is a safe method of treatment. And as a result of this, most of our bodies, the European bodies, this is the American Society of Urologic Oncology, the American Urologic Society, the American Radiology Society, the American Society of Clinical Oncology. This is what's called the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, which is all the NCCI cancer centers. They all got together and they feel that active surveillance is reasonable for even intermediate risk cancer, not just low risk cancer. Now, obviously, you want to be selective about this, and we're using tests to help us. But you don't want to just say, oh, if it moves, shoot it, right? You want to be very selective, and this is saving our patients a lot of hassle, a lot of trouble, okay? And this is very safe. So the pendulum swung from screening everybody to treat everybody to stop screening, right? And in fact, there are lots of patients where they aren't even being checked for cancer anymore because of that D grade that we got. Now, I propose that this should be balanced. We shouldn't go back to where we're treating everybody and screening everybody, And we shouldn't go to where we're doing no screening. There should be balance. And this pendulum should be in the middle. We should figure out who to screen, how often, so we can find the bad cancers. We can find, especially the 15 guys that are going to die from it. We should leave the less worrisome ones alone. We should figure out better ways to screen, and I'm going to be talking about those. We should develop new treatments which are less invasive, but equally effective. Okay? And so as a result, we're watching more people, we're getting better. We have gotten better. In 2017, they gave us a new grade, right? They said we have a C. And they said, especially for younger patients, talk to the patient, and particularly men with family history and African American and high risk populations, you should definitely consider screening, right? But for everybody else, you need to talk about it and talk about the balances, right? That some bad things can come from finding a cancer, especially if you overtreat it. So I put this here because, you know, we went from one problem and the pendulum swung the other. And you can see here, unfortunately, Wile E. Coyote gets a big cannonball in the face. And we have gotten a little bit of that because I think that the public health infrastructure in the United States, the government, came and gave us a D grade, and they were well-meaning, but there are consequences that came from it. And usually, and we knew it, and we were very upset that they said stop screening because we knew the benefits. We just knew that we had to get better about it, right? And we've been working on it, and our methods of screening are way better now than they used to be. Now here's the issue. The people that know most about this are the surgeons and the medical oncologists, right, that screen for prostate cancer. Although most screening is done by primary care docs, internal medicine docs, and family medicine docs, okay? So you can see less than 10% of screening from PSA is done by the specialists, which is okay. And I absolutely encourage that. But the problem is that when public health, well-meaning public health interests say to stop screening, they completely stop screening indiscriminately. And as a result, over that period of time from 2010, we stopped finding the cancer. The number started going down. Our number of biopsies went down, okay? And what we discovered now, it took about 10 years to figure it out, but we're finding less and less cancer, right? And the number of people that are showing up with spread cancer is going up ever since they hit the brakes on screening. Here's 2010, 2011, 2012. And so a lot of that improvement in death is going away. And so when I went into practice about 10 years ago, the death rate from prostate cancer finally fell below 30,000. And now every year we look, it's more. And now I told you it's 33, right? It was going down every year after year. And now for finally, and that's because, you know, whole hog, many people stopped getting screened. And the losers in that are the people that were showing up. And we don't want to go back to where it was, where people were dying, 40,000 men. We want to save those guys, okay? You can see here the annual death from prostate cancer has been going down year after year after year from about 1990. And then we turn the corner immediately. You stop, and there's a lag time, but it stopped going, and it started going back up. Coincidence with the lack of screening. So how do we fix it? We shouldn't focus on the fact that screening sucks. We should admit it, but we shouldn't focus on that. We should fix it. That's the best way. And so we focus on who needs it, make it safer, and then we don't overtreat. We use biomarkers, and I'm not going to go too much into detail about this because I'm going to talk to you about other things. But we have a whole array of tools that some doctors use and others don't. At Rush, we have access to every one of these. And we don't use every one of them at the same time, but we use them when we need them so that we can figure out who to biopsy, who not to biopsy, figure out who to screen and who not to screen. and figure out who to be very hands-on with and figure out who not to. And so as you can see, there's a bunch of blood and urine tests on top of just that blood test that we used to have that can add and help us. It used to be closer to a coin flip of whether it was right or wrong. And now if you add these together, we add so much more information, okay? In addition to all of these tests and biomarkers and genomics and genetics, I'm going to be talking to you about how imaging can be helpful. It used to be that we knew very little about what's going on in the prostate. We did a blood test, we did an ultrasound, and now we can see inside. These were my mentors at the NIH, and they basically taught me everything that I know about this problem. And essentially, they admitted to themselves, they didn't argue, they said, hey, listen, prostate cancer is terrible. Prostate cancer screening needs a lot of work. What can we do to fix it? And so Peter Pinto here in the middle is a surgeon there. He's the head of prostate cancer treatment at the National Cancer Institute. He's a government employee. And they invented a new way of identifying this. And so here's the head radiologist at the NIH. And this is an interventional radiologist that helped set up the engineering teams to invent these new machines. And the machines that we use all over the city and at Rush were invented by these guys. And so I was there when they were invented, so I know a lot about it. This is this hospital. And it used to be, when we first gave the talks, nobody had this equipment. Now everybody knows. Everybody knows and does it. But this is the hospital. You have all the labs here connected to the hospital. This is just north of Washington, D.C. And this is where actually, you guys know Anthony Fauci. This is where he works, right? And so we saw him when we were working there. I was there for about 3 years, and it was really life-changing. So my goal here is to take some of those ideas that they're inventing and bring them out to the community, and that's their goal too. So what imaging does, the point of it is not to find everything. It's not to add to the problems. It's to acknowledge the problems that exist, right? The fact that there are complications from treatment, there's complications from just diagnosis, and that we have to use it not to treat everybody. This isn't a business. This is a way of saving guys. And if we had perfect imaging, like we do in other cancers, right? So when when women are diagnosed with breast cancer, they get a mammogram. They find the area that they're worried about, and they put needles directly in that spot. And sometimes they just treat just that spot, okay? And we don't do that in prostate cancer yet. We're getting there. And it takes pictures first. And so, 10 years ago, we didn't do many pictures, and now we do. The reason is that the old way of doing it missed a lot of cancers. We only used an ultrasound. You couldn't see really where the cancer was, where it wasn't. It just told you where the edges were, okay? And it missed about half of cancers. So now, this is an example of a detailed MRI, and you can see directly into the prostate. You can see all the little nooks and crannies. You can see the bladder next to the prostate. You can see all of the neighboring structures, right? You can see the rectum. You can see everything. You can see it very well. And so what this allows us to do is now say, oh boy, the whole prostate looks the same, but there's this area that looks a little weird. I wonder, could there be cancer there? And so we don't just take this one picture, but we take 3 different pictures. And what this is when you take this picture and you look at the prostate and you say, wait, I wonder, is there something here in the corner at 10 o'clock? And you take it over here and you say, oh yeah, there is something there. And there's signal in all the different ways we take the picture. Then this is a prostatectomy where we removed it, and they said, oh yeah, that's where the cancer was. This was all the work that they did, all the fundamental research work that they did, and they said, yes, we can see it. It's not perfect, but we can see it, and we know more than we knew before. What can be done about it? So what they did is they invented a machine where our biopsies become smart. And this is a video of us moving through, and the ultrasound doesn't see these spots, but the MRI does. And so now our needle can go right into the area that looks funny on the MRI. You can see here we're going, and so we're turning here. We're turning on the MRI. This area looked unusual. So we're going to go in and put the needle up to there, and we're going to take that needle. We're going to come up to it, and we're going to fire a shot right into it, right? Just like here, we're going to go fire a shot right up to it and fire right at it. And when you go to those spots, what happens is if you don't go to the spots, that's this sort of light green pea green bar. Right? This was the first 100 cases of cancer when we did the ultrasound. We found cancer this many times, but if you added on those targets, we found so much more cancer, especially if the MRI looked funny. Right? And so we added on another 20 or 30% of cancers that were missed. So now 10 years has gone by and we've convinced people that this works. And we find ways that allow us where this really helps. Like for instance, if someone did a biopsy the old-fashioned way, which I don't do anymore. But if they do it and then they don't find cancer and they're still worried about it, you don't do it again. It used to be that people did it again, and they did it over and over and over. Now we advise them, take a picture, see where it looks unusual, and see if you can get that spot. Next is if you found to have cancer and it looks low risk, instead of rushing into the operating room and say, oh boy, it could be really bad, this could be the tip of the iceberg, you say, well, why don't we do an MRI and find all the spots that look weird and see if it really looks, if it looks low risk, let's leave it alone. Right. And so here's an example of that. This was after we had done about 500 or 600 cases at the NIH. I looked at the 200 cases where the guys had already had a biopsy the old-fashioned way, and it didn't show cancer. Some guys had up to 9 biopsies. Here's all the guys with 1, 2, 3, and 4 biopsies. They had biopsy after biopsy after biopsy that didn't show cancer. And yet we took a picture, and then we found a bunch of cancers in those guys, especially if it was highly suspicious. And so what this told us is that the old-fashioned way was missing cancers that the MRI could uncover. We published this almost 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago. And after that, it was released out into the public. This was when it was still experimental. Now, we say that we should do it. Some people even say we should do it, just go to those areas, but I think we should combine the best of the old way of doing it with the way of doing it. So my mentor is Dr. Behel, right, and Dr. Choiki, and Dr. Brad Wood. They got together and they published in the New England Journal earlier their first 2,000 patients that they took care of this way. And what they found was that if you did these targets, it upgraded the cancer a high number of times. So for instance, they found more cancer by combining it 10% of the time. And it went to a higher grade group 20% of the time. So there were times that the standard biopsy suggested that it was low risk, but the actual targeted biopsy says, oh no, it's a high risk cancer. So it properly identifies the people you want to worry about, right? Now, if you did targets only and you don't want to abandon the old way of doing it, because if you did that, you would miss some cancer still. The other thing that they found was that if you combined it and included these MRI targets, only 3.3% of the time did the pathology, was it wrong? Did it miss something? It was almost always right. It lined up, okay? And that's, as opposed to the old-fashioned way, almost 20% of the time, you would miss high-grade disease. Here's an example of this. So this lines up the cancer based on biopsy versus surgery, right? And so in the old days, they said, oh, well, if I find a little bit of cancer, we go to surgery. Up to 40% of the time, there was worse cancer. And so here you can see the systematic way of doing it is the old-fashioned way. Some people call that blind biopsy. And what happens is 40% of the time, here you can see 168 men of the 400 men that went to surgery were found to have worse cancer if you considered only their systematic. But if you combine that systematic with targeted biopsy, the upgrades only went to 15%. And it really was only upgraded to a serious miss 3% of the time. So what lined up was much more conducive to real answers. So when you have tools, it allows you to be less aggressive. If I do a targeted biopsy with MRI and it shows a low risk, 100% of my patients are going to be offered leaving it alone. And that is how we address the overtreatment problem. Now, some people are using MRIs to skip biopsy, and do that, but you want to be careful because MRI is not perfect. Okay? And different series have shown that between 10 or 15% of patients that have no lesions on their MRI could be missing a cancer that you would want to move on, intermediate risk cancer or above. So we have to be careful about getting too excited about it. And we have to know the limitations of our new tools. However, having said that, it's not a terrible maneuver. And this is a series of men that they flipped a coin. They said, here's 500 men. They did it in 11 countries, including the United States. And they flipped a coin. This was published in the New England Journal a couple of years ago. And they said, if you had an MRI, then you would do a targeted biopsy. And if you didn't have an MRI, they would leave it alone for half the men. So they used MRI and half the men. And the other half the men, they didn't use MRI, and they just did the old-fashioned way where they just biopsied everyone. And when you did that, if you used the targeting, a third of the men were able to avoid having biopsy whatsoever, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the men. And they found more cancers. 38% more were identified, or I'm sorry, 38% of the men were identified with cancers you'd want to deal with, as opposed to only 26% of the men having a standard biopsy. So these guys were likely, this group likely had some misses. So every one of these guys had a biopsy, so some men weren't able to be avoided, and they found more low-risk cancers. So of the men that they were found to have cancer, they found more low risk, and it's better not to know about these because they don't kill you, and they lead to a lot more treatment. So some have advocated using MRI to replace biopsy. I don't do that except in very select cases. I do it a little bit, okay? So what about on that D report card, they said, well, you get a D because even the biopsy has frequent complications. And this is something I lose my mind to. Lots of doctors say they don't look at this is sort of the hospital together in the United States. They said any complication, this is the number of biopsies, right? So even with the number of biopsies dropping off with the screening, the number of complications with biopsy is about 10 per 100,000. So it's rare, but it happens. Not 100,000 biopsies per 100,000 men, right? And what they found was, as a percentage, any complication is about a 10% rate, but most of them are not very serious. But hospitalization, so sepsis and hospitalization, these are very serious. And right around 2% of men were hospitalized after their biopsy, right? And right around 1% of them needed to end up in the hospital for sepsis. Okay, and so some people say, well, that doesn't but even in this fancy multi-institutional group that includes the best hospitals in the world, in this New England Journal paper, there's a 2% biopsy in both arms. And that's because of a very specific thing about biopsy, and I'm going to be talking about that. And I've been working on this at Rush, ways to make biopsy safer. We're developing new ways to not only find the right answer and to get the better answer and use all the tools so that we don't overtreat, but how about doing it safer so that 1 out of 100 guys don't end up in the hospital with a bad infection? If people were doing this with breast cancer, there would be marching on the streets. People would be very angry. But it's a silent question. I tell all my patients about it. And that's why I really bent my mind to this problem. So here's an example of why that is. So in a typical biopsy, the ones standard in Chicago and the United States, not necessarily around the world, because in other countries, many other countries, like in Australia and the UK, they're abandoning it. But you put an ultrasound probe in the bottom to take a good picture of the prostate. And what you can see here is there's a needle going through and slipping through the rectal wall. And just as a reminder, this is where our poop comes out of, right? This is where feces come out. And I think anybody, even a small grade school child knows that that's a very contaminated area, right? You don't want poop on a cut, right? And so when you do that, when you sample through the rectum, which is the standard way of doing it, that's why there's about a 1% chance of infection. And so we give antibiotics to prevent that. But until we move this needle to a different area, not through the rectum, you're always going to have to contend with about 1 in 100 guys getting sick, very sick after this biopsy. Now, having said that, there is a different way, and it's been done for years, but not commonly in the United States. And usually it had required, up until recently, going to sleep, and it was difficult to do in the office. And essentially, instead of going through the rectal wall, we went through the skin, right? And so here's the penis, and here's the scrotum, and in the skin between the scrotum and where the poop comes out, the anus, there's a patch of skin. And even though it's a little bit farther away, it's not a couple of millimeters away, there's a way to get needles in through there, okay? And that's a much safer way of doing it in terms of biopsy, but it's harder. And so starting about 2017, I got to Rush in about 2016, but in 2017, I was the first surgeon in the state to start doing this on awake patients to diagnose their prostate cancer. And the reason is that we have different ways. And here's another example. So for one, there's this infection rate, and the other is all our biopsies are centered on the back of the prostate. And what you can see is that the top of the prostate away from the cancer, away from the rectum, is undersampled. And that's another way you can miss cancer. And so when you bring the needle in straight on, you can get to this top of the prostate a little easier. Okay. So, like I said, the other countries have looked at this, and they found a much less likelihood of infection. In Australia, they did 7,000 cases, and they had 0.076, not 1%, but 0.076, right, infections. Here's 245 patients, and then it was later updated to 1,200 patients, 0 infections in Australia. So I believe it's about at least 10 to 100 times less likely to cause infections. So overall, the transrectal is quicker, it's more convenient for the provider, you can do it under local anesthesia, it's a familiar approach, but it can cause a lot of infections. The transperineal, it's more clean, less infections, but generally it had been done in the operating room. And so what we've been working on is ways to do it safely and comfortably awake. And I worked with a urologist that invented this device that has allowed that. This is just something that straps on to the perineum, and usually it just took a little American ingenuity. This guy works in Maryland, and he invented a device that makes it a lot more comfortable. And I've done hundreds of these biopsies and have been allowed to, with a new invention, to do it. And what we do is we thoroughly sample these areas of the prostate like that. And what we found, this is new data that we're working to publish now, is that we're able to do it safely with the low infection rate. We're able to find cancers more than we would expect. Right, the blue line is what we were expecting based on the old system, and the red line is what we're finding. And what we're finding is we're finding more cancers than you would expect, especially if we add MRI to it. And these are the guys that have MRI on board, and you can see we're definitely finding much more cancer than you'd expect. Another way that we're making more sophisticated biopsy is we're also refining and enhancing this transperineal biopsy to have a robot assist us in the aiming. And this has been most helpful for very confusing situations. And essentially, what we do is we plan out the biopsy, and we have a computer and a robotic system aim for us. They control the ultrasound and the aiming system, and in select patients, we're able to figure it out. And what we can do is get a very three-dimensional, go to very specific spots, and go right there. And so it allows for very precise robotic control. The system at Rush is the only one in the United States except for one other in Maryland. And it allows essentially us to start getting understanding of where the cancer is and where it isn't. And then it begins to open our mind about whether we're able to, and I haven't had a patient yet say, well, doc, if you know where my cancer is, why can't you just treat that? Why do you have to put a radiation all through the prostate? Why do you have to freeze the whole prostate? Why can't you just treat that part? Why do you have to go in and cut out the whole prostate? And that's a great idea, and people have been working on it for years. This is called partial gland therapy, and it's just been approved in the United States, and it's still experimental, and we're starting some of these experiments at Rush using different technologies like ice and laser and special probes and special ultrasound technologies to go and hit right in the spot. And so now that we have these, but that's the future, okay? So finally, we have future directions. These are different ways of just killing just that area, maybe trying to figure out better ways of predicting the cancer. And in conclusion, imaging has improved the diagnostic power to detect cancer. We know that. Most importantly, it allows us to be better at over-treatment. So that instead of letting go and canceling and having that cannonball hit us right in the face like Wile E. Coyote, that we can be like the Roadrunner, where we can avoid the problems, right, and run around them and figure out who to treat and who not to treat. It also allows more certainty and more confidence, and everybody's happier. The patients love it, the providers love it, and I think that it really helps us through very confusing and troubling waters. So I want to pause here. I think we're right on the dot in terms of time. I want to be able to, I'm going to switch back to the thing, and hopefully if there's any questions, and it looks like there's enough people that people can just turn on their mics so that we can answer anybody's questions.
Yeah, perfect. And so at this time, we're going to go ahead and switch over to Dr. Behel. Before that, we do have a question for you, Dr. Vourganti. In terms of when you've had many conversations. You've had many conversations with patients up till now about cancer treatment. So, in the patient's perspective, what are good questions for patients to bring up in your encounters in order to balance that pendulum and in order to prevent overtreatment or undertreatment?
So I would say, number one, none of this is urgent, right? So you want to take a deep breath. And I bet Dr. Behel is going to have some great advice about that. Everybody comes in a panic, right? And in truth, this is not, and I want to emphasize to you that first slide that I told you, only 1 out of 40 guys die of it, right? And it's not right away. You have plenty of time. It's probably just as threatening to get a diagnosis of diabetes, or if your heart doctor says, oh, your heart's beating funny, that's probably more threatening than prostate cancer. It doesn't mean that you can ignore it. It just means that sometimes people are rushing and they feel like they have to make that decision. And so the most important thing to avoid overtreatment is know that you have time to make the decisions and time to get all your questions answered. And quite frankly, there's not one right answer. People will look at me and say, hey, well, that's all great. You told me about radiation. You told me about clinical trials. You told me about surgery. You told me about all these different options. And sometimes even that can be overwhelming. But they feel like, well, doctor, but there's a real answer in there. I want you to tell me. And I tell them, really, most importantly, there's lots of choices, and you can't choose all of them. The only bad choice is not choosing, right? And you have to be comfortable with your decision and know one way or another. And so it's like most other life choices, whether you live in the city or the country, or whether you go to college or go to the trades, or whether whether you go with one wife or someone else, right? There's no one right answer. There's plenty of wrong answers, but there's not one right answer. And the best thing is to really understand it. And most people, in my experience, regardless of their education, they can really figure it out on their own, their values. And it's most important to figure out your own values and find a team that's willing to listen to you about that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. And one more question before we move on is, when patients first receive a diagnosis, it seems like the first thing that they do is just hop onto Google and learn as much as they can, which can, of course, just be a plethora of information that's false or not even relevant to their situation. So are there certain resources that you would promote, or certain websites, or any kind of resource that you guide your patients to get more information?
So the internet is it's the cat out of the bag, right? So you can't get rid of it. And just like anything, it's just like the news on TV. You have to be mindful of how you use it, right? And a lot of times people are exerting their stress through this information gathering, right? And what you have to know is you do have to arm yourself, right? And so there are very reliable sources. The NIH website, the National Cancer Institute website is excellent on cancer.gov, right? The American Cancer Society website is excellent, cancer.org, right? And so, and there's no shortage. Russia's website is excellent, right? But what you have to know is there's also a lot of hucksters out there. There's a lot of people that what they chose for themselves, they want to go out and they want to market. And there's a lot of bias that way. They say, well, I did it and it worked for me. Or anybody that doesn't do it that way is an idiot, right? And the truth is that's not true, right? Because everybody goes to a different church and everybody goes to a different grocery store. And some people on vacation, they like to head up to Wisconsin, and some people like to go to Michigan, and some people like to dive out of planes, and some people, just like to sit at home, right? And they're all right. And so the truth is everybody has a little different risks that they want to do. So I would say a good cancer.org and cancer.gov are great places. Cancer.gov is where I trained at the National Cancer Institute, and cancer.org is the American Cancer Society. There's also specific ones for every disease, right? So there's the Prostate Cancer Foundation and whatnot, but your doctors will help you find it. And then we see the others, the people that are learning too much just on Dr. Google or on YouTube or Twitter or whatnot, and there are ideas that you can get, but sifting through the amount of information takes time. And so sometimes going and getting a book and reading a good book at the library, librarians are very helpful, right? And the Rush Library is very good. There's lots of resources, but your doctor can help you sort through that, and you don't want to use it as a method to exert your stress, because I'm sure Dr. Behel can tell you that there's lots of ways that we cope, and some of them can make your stress worse, right? And that I see a lot. right? That I see a lot.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Vourganti. That was a perfect transition. And we'll welcome Dr. Jay Behel to the screen. And do you have your PowerPoint ready to go? Do you need any help there?
And Jay, you're still muted. I'm going to unmute myself, but I'm going to mute myself.
There we go. I have it. It doesn't look like I have an option to share it, though.
Oh, right. So we'll take care of that in just a moment.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here. Sorry I'm late.
Hey, Torrance, are you able to switch it over?
Hi, Dr. Behel. Yes, you're a presenter now. So there's a little share content icon. It's a little square with an arrow up on the bottom toolbar there.
There we go. All right, I'm having some difficulty here.
And I can share it as well if that's easier. Let me know.
All right, now I got it. There we go.
Perfect. We can see it.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my name is Jay Behel. I'm a clinical health psychologist here at Rush and do 9 or 10 or 11 other things. So I know a little bit about what I'm talking about when it comes to stress management because I have to manage a lot for myself. And I think to one of Dr. Vourganti's points about sort of making big healthcare decisions is to recognize that when we get bad or concerning news from a healthcare provider, emotions run very high and we tend to want to respond from those emotions. But as he was mentioning, there's often a lot of data and information that your healthcare providers can help you navigate through. And it's really important to sort of contain and manage those emotions so that you can process that data at the highest level possible and make really good decisions for yourself, not from a place of emotion, but from a place of knowledge. So that's not overall what my presentation is about, but that was a very good point that he made that I wanted to comment upon. And so really quickly, we only have a few minutes. The things that I want to touch on today are talking about ways to name and recognize stress. Sometimes we guys in particular have a hard time even knowing that stress is going on for us when we're in the middle of it. To recognize that we all have a variety of sources of stress. Talk about how stress may or may not be different for us guys than it is for others. Talk about some strategies for, first of all, expressing stress, and then as well as some strategies for managing stress. Having difficulty. There we go. All right. So would ask everybody listening right now to just take a very short moment to think about stress. And when I say that word, and you think of the last time you were stressed, what did that feel like for you? Where did you feel it? How did you know that that was stress that you were feeling? Just what was going on for you? And I also meant to say this at the very beginning to acknowledge that this is a presentation that I use in a lot of different settings that I've used a number of different times here with Rush Generations. And this is a very different moment that we're living through right now than when I've given this presentation before. So I just want to recognize that stress is sort of floating around at a very high and heavy level right now, more so than really in my entire life. So I'm talking in general terms and just want to acknowledge that what it's feeling like for all of us right now is probably very different than what we would consider our normal stressors. Yeah, and just naming that is going on for really all of us right now. But again, thinking about stress and what it feels like for you, and where you feel it. And for myself, I know I'm stressed, and I know that I've been under really intense focal stress when I have pain in my lower back. I realize this, even though I'm a psychologist, I still have lessons to learn about myself, and recognized a few years ago that after doing something really stressful, especially where I was kind of in the spotlight and had to present or had to talk or the focus was on me, that leaving those events, I always just felt it in my lower back, and that even if it was something that had gone really well that I felt good about, that there was a certain amount of stress I was carrying there in my back. And a lot of times we do carry stress in our bodies. Sometimes it is the more emotional stress or more intellectual stress where we know it's going on or we feel it's going on, but other times it really is just landing in our muscles, or maybe in our digestive tract, and we're really carrying it around in our bodies without necessarily having named it. So knowing that that's the case, it's important to then move on to begin to have a vocabulary around how we talk about stress. To walk around just saying I'm stressed or maybe saying nothing at all is not always that productive. It's not that specific. It's hard for other people to know what we mean when we say we're stressed. So the more that we can build a rich emotional vocabulary, the clearer we can be with our loved ones about what's going on with us emotionally, the more that we can talk through with ourselves what exactly it is that we're feeling at any given moment, and not just having this undifferentiated idea that we're stressed, but really to be able to say, for example, we're enraged, hopefully not, but feeling enraged is a very stressful feeling and is a very different feeling than feeling disappointed or feeling disapproving or exasperated. So beginning to develop a deeper and deeper emotional vocabulary, again, which to stereotype just a little bit, we guys are not really socialized to be as emotional and as forward with our emotions and talking about them as women tend to be. So this can be a skill that guys have to develop a little more, but it pays off in the long run because, again, we're able to have deeper conversations with ourselves and with others about what is going on with us emotionally at any given time. Oops. So this is where in my live presentation I like to open it up and ask people to identify sources of stress, but just because microphones on, microphones off, all of that, it gets a little noisy. I'm going to skip that right now, but just ask you to maybe make some notes to yourself about what are sources of distress or stress rather for you. I know for me, work is certainly a source of stress. As I mentioned, I have a number of different roles that I play here at Rush, and balancing those roles and coming into work and not necessarily knowing which of those roles is going to be most important on that day can be really gratifying, but also can be quite stressful. I'll share a little bit about my personal life. The pandemic is very stressful. And in the middle of the pandemic, I have 2 kids who are graduating, one from high school, one from middle school. That's not happening for them. They are home all the time. So having all the family at home almost all the time, I do get to continue coming to the hospital, which is actually quite nice. But to have a lot of together time when we're all dealing with stress and disappointment of not having graduations, and my 20th wedding anniversary is tomorrow. It is not going to be a terribly celebratory wedding anniversary. Just dealing with all of those kinds of things are definitely sources of stress. And I think in addition to the kind of work, money, relationships that most people cite as sources of stress, the pandemic has really brought, and the recent unrest and violence have added even another layer to it. So we all have new stresses that we're also trying to deal with. So recognizing stress when it happens is very important. And there's always this question of, is stress different from men? Do men experience stress differently? And some of this research is very out of psychology, out of social science, looking at how men and women are socialized and whether that changes the way that they experience stress. But there's also research around sort of inherent cortisol responses, stress responses at a biological level. And the short answer that I'm going to make longer than it probably needs to be is that it really depends on how you're looking at this about whether stress is different from men. Men actually report less stress than women. So if you we're going to do a survey of 100 people that you ran into at random on the street. A higher percentage of women would say that they had stress and would rate their stress as higher than men. But men, if you then follow up with a question about how able they feel to manage their own stress, men report having fewer tools to manage the stress that they do have, whereas women reporting more stress feel better able to manage that stress. And men actually have higher rates of illnesses that are thought to be related to stress. So the stress really hits home harder, sometimes much harder for men than for women, even though sort of the emotional part of stress is experienced more by women. Men are more stressed by crowding, finances, and work than are women. The work data is old data. Women are more and more, obviously, fully in the workplace, fully balancing. Often women are balancing a very full home life and the responsibilities that go along with it, and a very full work life. So I think that data is probably outdated at this point, but that's the historical data that says men have more work-related stress, more financial stress, and are just more physiologically stressed by crowding. So being in a crowded elevator, I know for myself, being in a crowded space trying to eat and unwind is very stressing for me, and that seems to be hardwired along with our gender and gender identity as men. And there are studies, I'm just going to skip that. So there are data that suggest men experience stress differently. However, for any given man, the similarities with any given woman probably outweigh those differences that I've just talked about. And this is a graph that shows the distribution of height for men and women. But really, if you look at almost any experience or factor that men and women have, you're going to come up with a very similar graph that shows that although there are differences, so the top of this graph for women and men are a little bit different. There is a distance there, and there's a little bit distance here, and from here to here, the lowest number for women and the highest number for men are a good bit apart. This sort of pinkish purple area in the middle is the biggest area, and that's the area of overlap where men and women have things in common. So even though, again, there are outliers in which the gender differences are very apparent, most of us aren't outliers. Most of us are going to be in this big middle section where men and women are more comparable. So moving forward, when we're going to talk about managing stress, the first thing is to know that it's happening for you. And then the next thing is going to be to express it. And I'm going to talk about expressing it in terms of expressing it with another person. But part of the expressing stress can be about expressing it to yourself. Like I said earlier, developing that emotional vocabulary that you're using when you're talking to yourself, as well as when you're talking to others. So expressing stress, first of all, you do have to do that self-talk part of labeling it for yourself. Then you're going to want, especially if this is new for you, if you're not used to talking about your feelings and feeling stressed, you want to be pretty deliberate about who you choose to tell. You want to choose to tell somebody who you have a fairly reciprocal relationship with, someone who you listen to and support, who you can reasonably expect to listen to and support you. Even having done that, you want to manage your own expectations. You don't want to build it up that if I tell this person my stress, they're just going to take it all away, or they're going to do something above and beyond to help me manage it. Manage your expectations. Even the people you love most are probably going to listen kindly, give you some words of sympathy, and then move on. And I think it's reasonable to expect that, and to manage your expectations, and again, to not expect them necessarily to stop their whole day to hear you and help you solve it, but to just give you a listening ear, some words of empathy or sympathy, and then very likely move on with their own day. And then if in communicating your stress, you're actually asking for something from your loved one, from the person you're telling, do so assertively. And I'm going to tell you what assertiveness means. This is my crash course in assertiveness. We tend as a culture to communicate either very aggressively in this very direct, kind of close to attacking way, and I'm giving the example of how you pick the restaurant you're going to when restaurants are open and are places you actually can go. The aggressive approach is to say, you always pick the restaurant. So to go on the defensive or the offensive from the get-go, or to be very passive, to say, well, if that's what's important to you, I guess that's okay, to sort of hope that the other party will read your body language, read your tone, will do something to guess at what you want without your having to say it. And I am a transplanted Southerner and now a Midwesterner, and Midwesterners and Southerners are very good at using the passive voice and trying to get other people to do what they want without ever having to tell them. That often leads to disappointment, though, and just a whole other kind of stress. So what I would encourage you to do is to think about communicating assertively, which is to say, to use an I statement, to ask for what you need, and to give the other party or parties the opportunity to do exactly the same thing. And if, when they've done that, there's a disagreement, then you have a disagreement to resolve, that one of you wants Indian food and someone else wants Italian food. Then you're going to have to talk it out and maybe decide to take turns, that this time you get to choose the Italian restaurant with the agreement that next time it's going to be Indian. But you've put your needs out there. You've been very clear about what you've needed. And it's extra important to do that when you're communicating about stress. If you're telling your spouse or partner that I am really overwhelmed today, and you're telling them that with the hope that they will take the kids to soccer practice, and you're doing that passively, you're just hoping they're going to mind read. They probably don't want to take the kids to soccer practice, so they have an invested interest in not reading your mind about that. So to communicate assertively of, I'm really overwhelmed today, it would be great if you could take the kids to soccer practice, giving them permission to say no, but of course hoping that they'll say yes, is a really effective way of not having one stress build on another stress build on another stress, because you're being really clear about what your needs are. So it's managing stress. So we've talked about identifying it for yourself, talking to another person about it, and now we're going to talk about things you can actually do about stress. So good stress management plan, and that's what I'm hoping, if you don't have already, people will work toward after this today, is to have a plan, to have an idea in your head. If I run into you 2 months from now and ask you what your stress management plan is, you will A, remember this presentation today, and B, actually have some ideas that, oh, when I'm stressed, and you can fill in the blank. And a good plan includes crisis management, which is what a lot of us think of stress management is. So when something goes really wrong, how do we keep it together so that we can move to the next step? And that's kind of what Dr. Vourganti was talking about, that we get bad news. We don't want to fall apart because we have to make important decisions. So what is the plan that allows us to do that? But also, stress management is like maintenance on a car. It's something you always have to be doing a little bit so that you don't break down and aren't always in crisis mode. So things that you can do every or almost every day that help you keep your stress level at a manageable level. So the first question I always ask, and I see people in all kinds of situations which are highly stressful. A lot of my clinical work is in our rehab hospital here at Rush, and patients have often had devastating illnesses hit them. They're having to navigate, how am I going to cope with this? And one of my first questions after I've gotten to know them a little bit is almost always, what's worked for you in the past? If you're older than 20 or 30 or 40, or certainly in your 50s or 60s, you've had some adversity. You've just part of life. You've had some setbacks in the past. So what's worked for you in the past? What are the things that have carried you through, been effective, helped keep you together in body and soul in the past? And I would encourage those of you listening today to kind of make a list of those for yourself. And then to think about ways of adding to your toolkit. When we do this live, I make some time and space for people to share things they've tried in the past. So I think thinking about people in your circle that you can reach out to and say, hey, I do this when I'm stressed. What do you do? And begin to build a toolkit that way. And then to also work on some of these universal practices that I'm going to talk about here. And I've come up with an acronym that is very nifty because it spells dream. And as nifty as it is, I actually had to remind myself what it was all about because it had been a couple years since I've done this presentation, but hopefully it sticks for you all and makes sense. So really quickly, because I'm mindful of time, the universal practices are, first of all, to try just distracting yourself from the stress. Read a book, listen to music, go for a walk. Moving on to try to relax. Do something that you know will relax you. It may be that distracting thing, or it may be something more deliberate, like a deep breathing or a guided imagery exercise. Sometimes those are really effective and you're done. But then moving on, you may need to use those expression skills that I talked about earlier to actually talk it out with another person. Or you may need to move on to abate, which is simply making a life change. I put this late in the list because making a life change is often very labor intensive. And if any of these other strategies can work for you to manage a stress, you certainly want to do that. But sometimes stresses are big enough and overwhelming enough that a job change, a relationship change, a move, a significant change in your routine or your transportation or something big about your life is going to be worth it because the payoff is just so big. But again, you want to try these lower hanging, easier to do interventions first. And then the last one here, just because it ends the acronym, not because it's the last in order, is using a deliberate meditation or mindfulness exercise to help you pull away from stress, help you be in the moment, manage things as they come, so that you aren't always being pushed into crisis mode. You have this sort of ability to center yourself and come back to a place of relative calm. So again, that you're not always at 9 out of 10 and then the next bad thing happens and you're pushed to 11 out of 10. Regular meditation and mindfulness can keep your stress level at a much lower level so that when crises do come along, you have some reserve to manage them. So really quickly, it's important for you to recognize your stress and its sources, to have a vocabulary for talking about assertively your stress, to know ways of coping both in crisis and routinely, and to use some strategies from the DREAM acronym there as a way to build your stress management toolbox. And happy to take any questions.